8 tankers, one night. A fuel corridor Russia thought was untouchable, gone before sunrise. The Sea of Azov, June 28, 2026, 11:47 p.m. A rotating convoy of 8 sanctioned Shadow Fleet tankers moves through the narrow eastern approach to the Kerch Strait, hugging the coastline with the quiet confidence of a logistics network that has never been seriously threatened. These vessels have made this run dozens of times. The route was deliberately chosen, a corridor designed to exploit gaps in Ukrainian maritime drone coverage, sitting just outside the effective operational range that Russian planners had mapped and memorized. The convoy carries thousands of tons of refined fuel. Destination: occupied Crimea and the southern grouping of Russian forces pressing on multiple fronts. The tanker crews believe they are invisible. They are not. 6 weeks earlier, analysts inside the SBU's Maritime Intelligence Division had started noticing a pattern. The Shadow Fleet was rotating, not randomly, but on a schedule. Intercepted logistics traffic, cross-referenced with commercial satellite AIS spoofing data and overhead imagery from Allied reconnaissance assets, revealed something Russian planners had assumed was safely hidden. These tankers were predictable. Their timing was predictable. Their corridor was predictable. And on the night of June 28, 2026, that predictability would cost Russia everything it had built in the Azov fuel network. I'm your host at Steelfront, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Tonight, we're breaking down Operation Sea Ledger, the SBU's coordinated naval drone strike on Russia's Shadow Fleet tanker convoy in the Sea of Azov. 6 weeks of patient intelligence work, 3 waves of maritime strike drones, 4 hours that severed Russia's primary fuel corridor to Crimea. By the time the sun rose on June 29, 2026, 6 of 8 tankers were disabled or ablaze. Russian fuel reserves in occupied Crimea had entered critical drawdown, and 3 Russian armored formations in the southern sector had received rationing orders for the first time since the 2023 Kherson withdrawal. Stay with me. What unfolds over the next 28 minutes explains not just what happened in the Azov that night, but why it represents a fundamental shift in how maritime logistics warfare is conducted in the 21st century. To understand what the SBU built and how they deployed it, you first have to understand what Russia was protecting, and why they thought they could protect it. The Shadow Fleet is not a Ukrainian term. It is not propaganda. It is a documented, internationally tracked network of vessels, tankers, cargo ships, and support craft that Russia assembled after Western sanctions began targeting its legal petroleum export infrastructure. These ships operate under flags of convenience, frequently disable their AIS transponders, conduct ship-to-ship transfers in international waters to obscure origin, and rotate ownership through shell company chains registered across multiple jurisdictions. By early 2026, Western intelligence assessments put the active Shadow Fleet at somewhere between 600 and 700 vessels globally, with a dedicated Azov Black Sea component numbering in the dozens, specifically tasked with sustaining fuel supply to Russian military operations in occupied Ukraine and Crimea. The 8 tankers in the June 28 convoy were the operational core of the Azov route. Ukrainian intelligence, corroborated by satellite imagery analysis from independent OSINT organizations tracking the fleet, identified them by vessel signature, displacement, and movement pattern. The largest, a 244-meter vessel that Ukrainian planners would designate Target Alpha, was a converted bulk carrier repurposed as a fuel transport, carrying an estimated 85,000 to 90,000 tons of refined petroleum products. The second major target, designated Target Bravo, was a 190-meter cargo-converted tanker running approximately 60,000 tons. The remaining 6 ranged from 120 to 160 meters in length and served as both fuel carriers and mobile electronic warfare platforms, equipped with Russian-supplied jamming systems designed specifically to disrupt Ukrainian maritime drone operations. That jamming umbrella was the key to Russia's confidence in this route. Which weapon system proved most decisive in dismantling it? Was it the naval strike drones themselves, the intelligence architecture that guided them, or the 3-phase sequencing that cracked the jamming envelope open? Comment below. A for the drones, B for the intelligence, C for the sequencing. The answer shapes everything else in this story. Russian maritime planners knew Ukraine had been developing naval drone capability since the Black Sea operations of 2022 and 2023. They had watched Ukrainian Magura V5 and Sea Baby drones strike Russian naval vessels. They had adapted. The electronic warfare suite deployed across the convoy was configured to emit coordinated jamming frequencies across the bands. Ukrainian maritime drones were known to use for GPS navigation and command link communication, with all 8 tankers maintaining close formation. Spacing of approximately 800 to 1,200 meters between vessels. The combined jamming footprint created an electromagnetic bubble roughly 4 kilometers in diameter. Inside that bubble, Ukrainian drones on standard navigation protocols would lose lock, lose command link, and go ballistic. It was a sound defensive concept. It had one fatal flaw. It required the convoy to maintain formation. The SBU's Maritime Intelligence Division had identified this dependency 3 weeks into the 6-week surveillance operation. Analysts tracking the convoy's electronic emissions through signals intelligence, corroborated by passive sensor data from Ukrainian allied assets positioned near the Kerch Strait approach, had mapped the jamming umbrella's coverage geometry precisely. A single assessment briefed to SBU leadership in mid-June 2026 made the conclusion explicit. The convoy's defensive capability was collective. Disperse the formation, and the jamming umbrella collapses. Each individual vessel's onboard jamming system was insufficient to protect itself from a determined drone attack. The convoy had built its security on interdependence. That was the vulnerability. That was the target. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface. The SBU had this assessment for 2 weeks before the strike. 2 weeks of watching those tankers run the corridor, delivering fuel, sustaining Russian operations, knowing exactly what needed to happen, and running the math on whether it could be done. The answer was yes, but only barely, and only if the 3-wave sequencing worked on the first attempt. The problem was launch geometry. Ukrainian-controlled coastline in the Sea of Azov region is not generous. Russian occupation of the southern shore and the Kerch area constrained Ukrainian maritime access significantly. To reach the convoy corridor, SBU drones launched from Ukrainian coastal positions would be operating at the outer edge of their effective range. There was minimal margin for course corrections, minimal margin for delays, and zero margin for a failed first wave. If the jamming umbrella was not broken cleanly in the opening minutes, the second and third waves would be flying into a fully operational electromagnetic envelope, and they would fail. The operational plan SBU maritime planners finalized in the 3rd week of June 2026 was built around accepting that constraint and engineering around it. 2 concealed launch points were established along the Ukrainian coastline, positioned to provide overlapping coverage arcs against the convoy corridor. The exact coordinates of these positions have not been released by Ukrainian authorities, and Steelfront will not speculate on their precise location. What Ukrainian General Staff reporting and subsequent OSINT analysis have confirmed is the operational structure. 2 sites, positioned to allow sequential wave launches with precise timing intervals calculated to exploit the convoy's response patterns. The drones selected for the operation were not a single type. Ukrainian defense industry reporting and post-strike analysis by independent military analysts indicated a mix of naval strike drone variants, including evolved versions of the Magura platform with enhanced range and updated electronic countermeasure packages, alongside at least 2 larger thermobaric-capable strike platforms for the penetrating hits against Target Alpha and Target Bravos. Fuel holds. The Magura V5 is a surface-running maritime drone approximately 5 meters in length, capable of carrying a warhead in the range of 320 kilograms of explosive equivalent, with a reported operational range exceeding 850 kilometers in favorable sea states. The evolved variants deployed on June 28 incorporated frequency-hopping navigation protocols specifically designed to operate in high jamming environments, a capability Ukrainian engineers had been developing in direct response to the Russian convoy's electronic warfare setup. 8 drones in the first wave, 4 in the second, 4 in the third, 16 total. That is what the SBU launched against 8 tankers and a Russian Coast Guard escort. The obstacle that almost stopped the operation had nothing to do with Russian jamming. It was the weather. Sea state conditions in the Azov on June 27th. The planned launch date ran to 1. 8 meters of wave height with wind gusts from the northeast pushing 24 knots. For surface-running maritime drones, that is at the edge of operational parameters. The Magura platform's recommended sea state ceiling sits at approximately 2 meters. SBU planners had built a 24-hour weather window into the operational timeline for exactly this reason, but that window was not unlimited. The convoy's next scheduled transit after June 28th would not occur for another 11 days, and Russian logistics planners, reviewing fuel reserve projections, might alter the route or timing if the June 28th transit was delayed. The operation was time-critical in both directions: too early, and the sea state grounds, the drones; too late, and the convoy changes its pattern. At 6 a.m. on June 28th, SBU meteorological assessment confirmed. The storm was tracking north faster than models had predicted. By 9 p.m. that evening, wave height would drop below 4 meters. Wind would fall to 12 knots from the west. The Azov would be operational. The launch window was 11 p.m. to 2 a.m., 6 hours earlier than originally planned. Every element of the operation — drone maintenance checks, navigation upload, crew positioning, coordination with signals, intelligence assets tracking the convoy — had to compress by 6 hours. The teams made it work. That is the short version. The longer version involves drone operators working through the afternoon heat on concealed launch infrastructure, uploading revised navigation packages that accounted for the updated weather profile, and coordinating in real time with SBU intelligence analysts, monitoring the convoy's position via satellite and signals intercept to confirm it was maintaining its expected track. At 9:47 p.m., with the convoy 140 kilometers from the first projected intercept point and tracking exactly as predicted, SBU leadership issued the authorization. Operation Sea Ledger was live. How many vessels would Ukraine disable or destroy in the next 4 hours? We will answer that precisely before this video ends. For now, keep that number in mind. A. 23 vehicles equivalent in tonnage. B. 6 of 8 tankers. C. All 8. Drop your guess in the comments. At 11:47 p.m., the first wave launched from primary position. 8 naval strike drones entered the water in a 90-second deployment sequence. They formed a loose fan formation, spacing of approximately 200 meters between drones, and began their approach run at surface level, navigating on frequency-hopping GPS protocols and passive infrared horizon sensing to maintain course without active radio emissions that the Russian jamming systems could detect and target. Speed, approximately 80 kilometers per hour. Distance to convoy, 140 kilometers at time of launch. Estimated time to contact, 1 hour and 45 minutes. At 11:49 p.m., 2 minutes after first wave launch, the second wave launched from secondary position. 4 drones configured for deep penetration strike against Target Alpha and Target Bravo specifically. These carried the heavier warhead packages. Their navigation programming routed them on a divergent approach track, adding approximately 12 minutes to their transit time, positioning them to arrive at the convoy precisely as the first wave's impact was expected to force the formation to scatter. At 11:52 p.m., the third wave launched. 4 drones programmed for interdiction geometry against the Russian Coast Guard escort vessels positioned at the convoy's northern flank. Ukrainian intelligence had identified 2 Sobol-class patrol boats and 1 larger escort vessel, assessed as a Raptor class, as the primary escort element. These drones carried smaller, shaped charge warheads optimized for disabling propulsion and steering systems rather than catastrophic hull breach. The objective for Wave 3 was not to sink the escort. It was to disable it before it could position to ram or net incoming drones targeting the tankers. 16 drones, 3 waves, 3 objectives, 1 sequencing logic binding them together. I spent hours going through the post-strike analysis documentation, OSINT investigations, Ukrainian General Staff releases, independent maritime tracking reports. And one detail kept pulling my attention back. The first wave's primary mission was not to destroy anything. It was to make the convoy panic. The drone operators understood that 8 fast-moving surface contacts on the convoy's radar would trigger immediate electronic countermeasures, which meant every jamming system would activate at maximum power, burning through power reserves and, critically, signaling to the second wave's navigation systems exactly where the jamming emitters were located. The first wave was bait, designed to be detected. It used the convoy's own defense as a targeting beacon. Ukraine doesn't just use weapons. Ukraine invents new ways to fight. 1:33 a.m., June 29th, 2026. The convoy's radar operators, aboard the 244-meter target Alpha, which served as the formation's command and electronic warfare center, detected the first wave at approximately 18 kilometers. 8 surface contacts. Fast-moving. Low signature. The alarm went immediately to the convoy's Russian Coast Guard escort, which began maneuvering to intercept on the convoy's port flank. Simultaneously, all 8 tankers activated their electronic warfare systems at full power, flooding the approach frequencies with jamming energy. Formation discipline held for approximately 4 minutes. 4 minutes was not long enough. The first wave drones did not alter course toward the jamming source. They maintained their fan approach, spacing out, spreading across a 2-kilometer front. Convoy commanders, watching 8 contacts spread rather than converge, faced an immediate tactical problem. The jamming umbrella's coverage geometry was optimized for a concentrated approach. Drones coming from one direction into a focused electromagnetic cone. 8 contacts spread across 2 kilometers required the tankers to maintain formation to provide overlapping coverage. But spread contacts also implied the possibility of flanking. The possibility that the real strike was coming from a different vector entirely while these 8 drones drew attention forward. At 1:37 a.m., the convoy's formation broke. Target Alpha, the 244-meter flagship, turned 15 degrees north, creating separation from the main group. 2 smaller tankers accelerated, increasing the formation gap. A third began a slow turn to the south. The jamming umbrella, which required all vessels within 200-meter spacing to function as a coherent system, began to degrade. The electromagnetic bubble developed gaps. And into those gaps, at 1:41 a.m., the second wave arrived. Stay with me. What happens in the next 18 minutes ends the Azov fuel corridor permanently. The second wave's 4 drones had been navigating on passive infrared, and the jamming emission signatures themselves for the last 90 minutes of their approach. When the convoy's formation broke and the jamming umbrella degraded, the frequency-hopping GPS navigation came back online cleanly. Updated position fixes, clear targeting geometry, 2 primary targets suddenly separated from the protection of their electronic companions. The drone operators, monitoring via satellite relay, made no adjustments. The navigation programming was working exactly as designed. At 1:44 a.m., the first second-wave drone struck target Alpha. The impact was on the vessel's port midship section, approximately 8 meters above the waterline. The warhead, assessed at approximately 250 to 280 kilograms of explosive equivalent in the penetrating configuration, breached the hull and detonated inside the No. 3 fuel hold. The resulting secondary explosion was visible from Ukrainian-controlled coastline 140 kilometers away. A column of fire, approximately 60 meters high. Burning fuel spread across the water surface in a radius of approximately 200 meters within 90 seconds of the initial detonation. Target Alpha was not sinking immediately. The vessel's remaining compartment integrity kept it afloat. But it was ablaze from midships to stern. Navigation and propulsion were destroyed, and it was functionally eliminated from the operational picture within the first 40 seconds of contact. 12 seconds after the target Alpha strike, the second wave drone reached target Bravo. The 190-meter vessel had turned north following the formation break, increasing its separation from the group. That turn had placed its engine compartment, the stern section, at an optimal angle for a stern approach strike. The drone hit at the waterline on the starboard aft quarter. The warhead penetrated the engine room bulkhead. Target Bravo's propulsion failed instantaneously. Emergency systems attempted to activate damage control flooding, but the secondary fire from the engine compartment penetrated the adjacent fuel transfer piping within 3 minutes of the strike. By 1:52 a.m., target Bravo was dead in the water and burning. The third and fourth second-wave drones, arriving at 1:46 and 1:48 a.m. respectively, targeted 2 of the mid-sized tankers, 140-meter and 135-meter vessels that had been part of the electronic warfare formation. Both strikes were assessed as successful hull penetrations. One vessel suffered catastrophic fuel ignition within minutes of impact. The second took damage to its propulsion but did not immediately catch fire. It would be confirmed as disabled and eventually scuttled by Russian salvage assessment teams in the days following, according to Ukrainian GOR intercept reports. At 1:41 a.m., simultaneous with the second wave's terminal approach, the third wave reached the Russian Coast Guard escort. The Sobol-class patrol boats were maneuvering aggressively, attempting to intercept the first wave drones still running evasive patterns across the convoy's forward arc. The third wave drones, approaching from the northeast on a trajectory the escort vessels had not anticipated, reached engagement geometry on the larger escort vessel, the Raptor class, first. Two drones struck in a coordinated pair attack, the second arriving 4 seconds after the first. The first warhead disabled the steering system. The second penetrated the engine compartment. The Raptor-class escort lost power and went dead in the water at 1:43 a.m., removing it from the interdiction picture before it could effectively respond to the main strike. The first Sobol class was struck at 1:46 a.m., propulsion disabled. The second Sobol class, maneuvering hard at speed attempting to net or ram the incoming drones, was struck at 1:49 a.m. All three escort vessels were non-functional before the main tanker strike wave had fully completed its run. What strikes me about this engagement, and we have looked at a significant number of maritime strike operations in this conflict, is the completeness of the operational design. This was not a strike that destroyed some targets and hoped the rest would be psychologically effective. The SBU's planning team had worked through every element of the convoy's defensive system and built a solution for each one simultaneously. The jamming umbrella, broken by Wave 1's dispersal forcing formation break. The tanker targets, penetrated by Wave 2 arriving into the degraded jamming environment. The escort, neutralized by Wave 3 before it could mount effective interference. 3 problems, 3 solutions. 1 simultaneous execution window of approximately 8 minutes. Here's our take, and it will probably generate disagreement. This operation should have been impossible given Ukrainian maritime access constraints in the Azov, and the fact that it succeeded is not just a credit to Ukrainian innovation. It is a direct indictment of Russian maritime situational awareness. Russia had months of evidence that Ukrainian naval drone capability was advancing rapidly. The Shadow Fleet convoy was operating on a predictable schedule, using predictable routing, with a defensive architecture that had one well-known single point of failure: formation, cohesion. Russian maritime planners chose to accept that vulnerability rather than redesign the convoy's defensive posture. That is not a tactical mistake. That is a strategic assumption that Ukraine would not be able to exploit it. That assumption was catastrophically wrong. By 2:03 a.m., with 6 tankers either ablaze or dead in the water and all 3 escort vessels disabled, the convoy had effectively ceased to exist as a functional formation. 2 tankers had survived the strike sequence. A 125-meter vessel that had broken away from the formation early enough to open significant distance, and a smaller 110-meter craft that had been positioned at the convoy's rear and had reversed course at high speed when the strikes began. Both vessels sustained no direct hits. Ukrainian drone operators, monitoring via satellite relay, assessed that the remaining drones did not have sufficient range and battery reserve to pursue the 2 survivors at the distances they had opened. The operation was called complete at 2:17 a.m. What the 2 surviving tankers reported to Russian Maritime Command, reconstructed from Ukrainian GOR intercept traffic, provides the clearest picture of what the convoy experienced from the inside. Signals intelligence assets monitoring Russian military communications in the Azov-Crimea corridor captured a sequence of transmissions beginning at 1:48 a.m. and continuing through early morning on June 29th. The contents, as assessed by Ukrainian analysts and partially corroborated by independent OSINT researchers monitoring Russian military communications frequencies, describe complete operational collapse. The convoy's command vessel, Target Alpha, was not transmitting. The escort was not responding. Of the 6 vessels that took hits, only 1 was transmitting damage reports, and those reports described fires in fuel holds that were beyond the capacity of onboard damage control teams to address. Russian Maritime Command's response to the initial reports was, according to intercept assessments, a request for confirmation that the information was accurate. The idea that a convoy running their proven electronic warfare protective formation had been hit at this scale was not something Russian planners had built a contingency response for. There was no contingency. That was the second catastrophic assumption. Put yourself in the position of a Russian logistics officer receiving these reports at 2 a.m. You have just been told that 6 of 8 tankers in your primary Azov fuel corridor are dead or burning. Your escort is non-functional. Your backup routing option, the Kerch Bridge rail corridor, has been progressively degraded by Ukrainian strikes over the preceding 6 months, and its current throughput capacity is estimated at roughly 35 to 40% of pre-strike levels. Your next alternative, overland routing through the northern Crimea land approach, adds transit time and fuel consumption that partly negates the supply benefit. And your fuel reserves in occupied Crimea, the destination for this convoy, are already running below comfortable operational margins because Russian logisticians had been relying on this maritime route's reliability to reduce their static reserve holdings. The answer that logistics officer had to give to his superiors was not, "We will reroute." The answer was, "We have a problem with no immediate solution." What would you have done in that moment? With a broken corridor, a degraded alternate route, and armoured formations in the southern sector reporting fuel status? Comment your operational assessment. We read every response, and this one generates serious tactical discussion. Ukrainian GUR reporting, released in fragmentary form over the 72 hours following the strike, confirmed the downstream impact. Fuel reserves in occupied Crimea dropped to critical operational levels within 72 hours of the strike. The definition of critical, in Russian military logistics doctrine, is reserves below the threshold required to sustain 30 days of combined arms operations at planned tempo. 3 Russian armoured formations in the southern sector. Ukrainian intelligence identified them as elements of the 58th Combined Arms Army and 2 attached independent brigades, though Steelfront cannot independently verify the specific unit designations, received fuel rationing orders within that 72-hour window. These were the first documented fuel shortage orders affecting combat readiness since the Russian withdrawal from the Kherson right bank in late 2022. The rationing orders did not halt operations. They constrained them. Mechanized maneuver operations require fuel at a rate that rationing makes extremely expensive in operational terms. Every armored advance, every repositioning, every logistics run consumes reserves that cannot be quickly replaced when the primary supply line has been severed. Ukrainian frontline units in the southern sector reported, in the days following the strike, reduced tempo of Russian armored probing operations, a pattern consistent with fuel conservation orders affecting mechanized unit activity. One detail in the post-strike assessment has stayed with me since I first read through the OSINT documentation. Satellite imagery captured on June 30th, 2026, 36 hours after the strike, showed Target Alpha, the 244-meter command vessel, still burning. The fire aboard the largest tanker in the convoy burned for more than a day and a half before the fuel load was sufficiently exhausted for the flames to subside. That single image, a 244-meter ship burning alone in the Sea of Azov with no rescue or salvage vessels approaching, says more about the state of Russian maritime capability in the region than any tactical assessment. The Russian Coast Guard had no vessels available to mount effective rescue or salvage operations in the strike aftermath. The escort force was disabled. Vessels from Crimean ports would have required several hours of transit time and would have been operating under the implicit threat that Ukrainian maritime drones might still be active in the corridor. The Shadow Fleet tankers, as non-military vessels, had no guaranteed military rescue priority. They burned, and Russian military planning had no immediate answer for what had just happened to one of its most reliable supply arteries. What's most surprising about this operation isn't the tactical execution, as sophisticated as that was. It's the intelligence duration, 6 weeks. For 6 weeks, Ukrainian analysts tracked this convoy, mapped its patterns, profiled its electronic warfare architecture, and built an operational plan that required the convoy to behave exactly as it had been behaving for 6 weeks. The operation succeeded not just because Ukraine launched drones at ships. It succeeded because someone in an SBU analytical office spent 6 weeks being patient when patience was the hardest option available. Is there a case to be made that Ukraine should have struck earlier, before the convoy had established such deep defensive confidence? Comment why yes or no. Was waiting 6 weeks the right call? The lessons embedded in this operation are not obscure. They are direct, applicable, and they have already begun influencing maritime security thinking in multiple national navies that are watching the Ukraine conflict as a doctrine laboratory. First, electronic warfare architecture that depends on formation cohesion can be defeated by forcing formation break before the main strike wave arrives. The Russians understood this theoretically. Their naval doctrine acknowledges dispersal as an electronic warfare weakness. They made a judgment call that Ukrainian maritime drones could not threaten them at Azov ranges with sufficient numbers to force a formation break. That judgment was wrong. Unmanned maritime strike systems have now crossed the range and payload threshold where they can hold convoy-scale targets at risk across bodies of water that were previously considered too distant for drone operations. Second, Shadow Fleet infrastructure is not as hidden as its operators believe. Commercial satellite coverage, signals intelligence from passive monitoring, AIS anomaly analysis, and pattern of life tracking by Western allied intelligence agencies and open-source analysts had collectively mapped the Azov corridor with enough fidelity to plan a precision multi-wave strike. The Shadow Fleet's survival has depended on operating in spaces where no one had both the will and the capability to strike. Ukraine demonstrated both simultaneously in the Sea of Azov on June 28, 2026. Third, integrated sequencing is now a baseline requirement for maritime strike operations against defended convoys. Single-wave attacks, or attacks that do not account for electronic warfare environments, are insufficient. The SBU's three-wave architecture, disperse, penetrate, interdict, is a doctrine contribution that will be studied. Fourth, and perhaps most consequentially, logistics interdiction at this scale forces strategic recalculation. This was not a tactical strike in the traditional sense. It was a logistics system attack. The goal was not to destroy the tankers as military platforms. The goal was to sever a supply line that Russian operational planning depended on. 6 of 8 tankers disabled or destroyed in a single night achieved an effect on Russian combat readiness in the southern sector that months of frontline attrition had not produced. Fuel rationing orders affecting armored formations constrain tempo, reduce maneuver options, and force Russian logistics planners to consume time and resources rebuilding a supply architecture from scratch. That is a strategic outcome. The Kerch Bridge rail corridor, already degraded, cannot fully absorb the Azov tanker route's throughput. Overland alternatives exist but are slower, more fuel expensive, and more vulnerable to Ukrainian long-range strike systems. Russian logistics planners, as of early July 2026, are managing a supply situation in occupied Crimea and the southern sector that is materially worse than it was on the morning of June 28th. Real tactics. Real consequences. Steel front. Now, the quiz answer from our question midway through this video. How many vessels did Ukraine disable or destroy? The answer is B. 6 of 8 tankers were disabled or ablaze within 4 hours of the first strike. 2 surviving vessels broke formation early enough to open distance beyond the drone force's remaining range and battery reserves. The 6 confirmed hits included the 2 primary high-value targets, 244-meter target Alpha and 190-meter target Bravo, both of which suffered catastrophic fuel hold and propulsion damage, plus 4 mid-size vessels ranging from 120 to 155 meters. All 3 escort vessels were also disabled, bringing the total strike tally to 9 vessels. 6 tankers and 3 escort craft, rendered non-operational in a single 4-hour engagement window. The strategic effect? Fuel reserves in occupied Crimea at critical levels within 72 hours, armored formation rationing orders within the same window, was not a secondary outcome. It was the designed operational objective, achieved precisely as the SBU's maritime planning team had assessed it could be. 3 questions before we close. Was the 6-week surveillance period the right call? Or did Ukraine leave operational value on the table by allowing the convoy to run the corridor unmolested for a month and a half while building its strike architecture? Would a faster strike, with less complete intelligence, have produced comparable strategic effect? Or would it have struck a convoy with its formation and jamming umbrella intact and failed? Could Russian maritime planners have prevented this? The convoy's electronic warfare architecture was sophisticated. Its defensive concept was sound in theory. Could Russian logistics commanders have introduced randomization into the convoy's timing and routing? Variable schedules, variable spacing, diversified electronic warfare configurations, sufficient to defeat the 6-week pattern analysis that gave Ukrainian intelligence the data to plan around? And what would you have done differently as a Ukrainian maritime strike planner? The 2 surviving tankers represent a planning constraint. Insufficient drone numbers to pursue dispersing vessels after the main strike. Would a 4th wave, positioned for pursuit geometry, have changed the outcome from 6 of 8 to 8 of 8? And would that marginal gain have been worth the additional operational complexity and the resource commitment? Drop your analysis in the comments. This community generates some of the most serious tactical discussion on YouTube, and this operation deserves serious treatment. Subscribe to Steelfront. We break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. Every week, the operational analysis, the tactical breakdown, the weapon specifications, and the strategic context that turns raw event coverage into genuine understanding of how modern warfare actually works. If tactics win wars, and they do, then understanding tactics is the most valuable investment you can make as a student of this conflict. The Sea of Azov is quiet now in the early morning light, but the wreck signatures are still visible on satellite thermal imagery. The heat bloom of Target Alpha's burned-out hull, the drift pattern of Target Bravo's disabled superstructure. Modern warfare punishes predictability. Russia built a logistics corridor on a schedule. Ukraine read that schedule. And on the night of June 28, 2026, the SBU proved once again that in this war, intelligence patience is the force multiplier that no weapons delivery package can substitute for. In our next analysis, we are looking at the frontline consequence. What Russian armored operations in the southern sector actually looked like in the days after fuel rationing orders went out. The connection between maritime logistics and ground force tempo is a story that deserves its own full breakdown. That video is coming. Stay with Steelfront. Real battles, real tactics, real consequences. Steelfront.